Thanks for joining, everyone. So we're going to be, I'm going to be taking you through the Proactis requisitioning module today or this afternoon. If you've got any questions throughout the session, please just pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. You've got two areas to ask questions in. Louise will be following the session as we go through. So if it's appropriate at the time, she'll stop me and ask the question. Otherwise, I can get to them at the end of the session. I won't be able to see you typing in, but somebody can prompt me and we can go through those. I have had a few laptop issues, so if I do disconnect, please be patient. I appreciate your patience. I will log back in again. I'm not going to disappear completely, sadly. Yeah, so we obviously run these webinars regularly. We run webinars on different topics every month. We did run a Proactis P2P requisition webinar almost a year ago now, or just over a year ago. So I think it's quite important that we cover the topic again. It's a topic that we get asked about quite a lot. We did many years back, and it became very quiet with requisitioning. Everyone wanted to raise orders directly, and I'll explain the difference between the two as we go through the session. But more recently, it seems to be that organisations are requesting, how can we do this? Or, can we raise requisitions up front for users? And so we're exploring that again and having lots of conversations with clients. Requisitions is a module that you will already be licensed for. It's part of the P2P. If you've got the full P2P, so ordering, receipting, invoicing, requisitions is part of that suite of modules. So you wouldn't necessarily be paying for additional license or software costs, I should say. It would just be, based on the users if you needed to increase your users, and obviously some setup costs in relation to consultancy. But we can come on to that later and how you can get started with it if it's something you did want to explore within your organisation. So we're going to be covering why you would use requisitions and really talk about, how, if you've got centralised buying, how it can help your business. The requisition process, so what the workflow or the process would be, approvers, so typically what an approver would be responsible for doing if you have the requisition module, how the buyers, how it would work with the buying process and the buyers, and who's responsible for creating the orders, who they would reside with, who would be the owner of the orders, and also the requisition module itself extends further than just raising requests for goods and services. So we can utilise it for other types of requests, for example, funding requests or just request forms. If you want to request something, it doesn't have to be goods or service. It can be a request for a new supplier or a new item, but I'll explain how it can help you in those areas as we go through. I will dip into software, so I do have some slides which you can all obtain a copy of. We can send them out, or you can download them from our website as well. But I will also show some software as we go through the demonstration. And also we'll talk about how you can get started, so what you would need to do if you did decide to explore requisitions. And we'll have some questions as well at the end. So centralised buying. So requisitions is traditionally used when the user raising the request for the goods and service doesn't know who the supplier is, doesn't know what the price of the goods or service item is. So they just want to request something. They don't care what the price is, they don't care who the supplier is or who it's being bought from or who the preferred supplier is or who you've got a contract with. It's not necessarily their responsibility, but they need to request something. So, for example, I need a new mouse, or I need a new laptop, or, I need some stationery. Typically, requisitions is generally used predominantly for IT goods and services or facilities type items. It can extend further. So we have got clients that implement requisitions where they want to request travel. So I want to travel from A to B. I don't necessarily know who I'm booking it with or what the costs are, but I want somebody to book this travel for me. I'm therefore raising a request. So it can really work well in those examples. So the requester would log into Proactis. Obviously, they'd have a login to the application. They'd request the item thereafter. They could raise a request for multiple items on a single template for all different types of goods and services. The system will be smart enough to know who to send them off to for approval If approvals is something you require at the requisition stage, it will also know which buying team to send them to. So buyers would typically be responsible for sourcing the goods and items, the goods and services at the relevant prices, the best prices. So the requester requests something, it goes off potentially for approval to a buyer who's responsible for sourcing the items. So they would know who the best suppliers are to buy from and what the prices should be. Buyers have the ability to consolidate requisitions. So if you've got lots of different requesters from different parts of the organisation requesting goods and services, potentially in different locations, they don't need to know each other, but they could be buying from the same suppliers, in which case the buyer has the ability to consolidate a requisition. They can consolidate a requisition or requisitions and create one single purchase order for across multiple sites, for example, or from multiple requests. Okay, when that supplier provides the goods and service, they're providing it potentially to a central location, or the goods can be delivered to the individual locations. It just depends how you've got the system set up. You can have automatic consolidation as well if you want to. So you can set schedules to run behind the scenes. So you can say on a particular date, at a particular time, I want a consolidation schedule to run for a particular supplier or across the board to consolidate all the requests and create single orders. So you gain more efficiencies when you have a single purchase order. Obviously, there are less deliveries being made by your suppliers as well, so there's less of a footprint there. So really, that's where organisations want to go as well. It allows buyers the ability as well to manage what's being requested in a more efficient manner. If potentially requesters are requesting something that you have in stock or you have in a cupboard or you have, something that's really refurbished, you don't necessarily need to go out and buy the item. You can provide them with something else and reject the original requisition with comments. So it gives you a bit more intervention there within the business. When orders are created, when the actual order is created with the correct supplier and the correct prices, you can determine who the owner of that order is. So will it be the buyer who sourced the items, or is it going to be the original requester? And it's quite important who owns it, because you need to identify who the notifications will go to in the event that there's a discrepancy. Does it go to the buyer or does it go to the requester? You've also got control over who receipts the order when the goods have arrived. Is it the requester or is it the buyer? Again, the department can be determined, and departments control security in Proactis, so that's quite key. Knowing who the order belongs to and which department gets stamped against it, because it will control who else can see that requisition within the business once it becomes an order. So you can control whether it's the buyer or the requester. It's actually quite a powerful utility within Proactis. Within the requisition module, you can have multiple templates or you can have a single template. It's very flexible. Items get classified. So the items that you have in your item listing, they get a category or a classification assigned to them behind the scenes. And that's how the system knows who to route relevant items to, or which buyer to route the items to. So you can have items marked as facilities items marked as travel or HR, or items marked as IT equipment, or whichever types of items you have stationary, and they can all be routed to different buying teams. You can specify, you can activate functionality on a template so that the user or the requester has to specify a maximum cost. So if they want something, they might have been told you can have it, but only for a certain cost. The approver also has the ability to override that field. So as they're approving the requisitions, prior to them being routed to the buyer, they can specify a maximum cost. Depending on the permissions the buyer has, they may not be able to exceed that maximum cost. So if the approver has said you can't spend more than £500 on a laptop, the buyer cannot source the item for more than that price. Okay. It's not essential for a requester to code the requisition. The request could literally go through with a description line if necessary, depending on how you've got the system configured. that the buyer can source all of the information and also provide the coding where necessary. Approval workflows, it can use a slightly different approval workflow engine. You can utilize the approvals that you've got within the rest of the system, so you can still have nominal based approvals or use the workflows that you've already configured, or you can utilize a different engine where it sends items off for approval based on the classification or the category of the item, or based on the department, or a combination of the type of item and the department. So you've got lots of flexibility around approvals on requisitions as well. They can also be approved from the mobile app. Let's not forget you've got the mobile app there. You can have requisitions approved at document level or at line level. So individual lines can be approved. You don't have to wait for the whole requisition document to be approved in full prior to the buyer being able to intervene and create an order. So you've got flexibility around that as well. So approvers get notified as normal that they've got a requisition to approve if you decide to have an approval workflow at the requisition stage. Some organisations have it in both stages. So the user would request something, it goes off to potentially to their line manager to say whether or not they can have the item. Then it would go off to the buyer. And then when the buyer creates the order, you can have an additional workflow at the order stage before the order is fully authorised. So you have lots of options there. When the requisition approver is approving the requisition, they have the ability to not only intervene and specify a maximum cost, but they can also themselves select the supplier and provide coding information if they wish. They can provide additional information, they can provide comments, they can add attachments, and approvers can also approve in batches. So that if they've got multiple requisition lines that require approving, they can tick, 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 tick and approve in one go, rather than going into every single line. So it's a slightly different process to what you would be used to typically for approving orders or approving invoices. The buyer has lots of options available to them. So there is lots of flexibility around how the buyer can convert requisitions into orders and how much intervention is required. So requisition creation and conversion to an order can be an exceptionally streamlined process if you want it to be. It can be as simple as the user raises a request, they click submit. If it's got coding and it's got a valid supplier and it's got valid prices, it can go straight through and become a purchase order automatically. The items that are on the requisition will control how streamlined it can be. So you can set certain items to require intervention by the buyer. Okay. However, where you do require touch points by the buyer and you want the buyer to be able to source the items, there are different stages we can activate. The buyer can copy the requisition line. So they can copy that requester has put on and create the order or create the draft order line off the back of the requisition line, and they can apply the coding, they can check and provide the supplier details, and then they can submit that, and it can sit in a consolidation stack waiting to be converted. So the buyer can go through and select all the lines, copy the lines, and then hold them in a holding area. When they're ready, they can use the consolidation option, either the automated option, or they can manually consolidate requisition lines and create a single purchase order. So all those requests that they've been sourcing, they get held, and then when the buyer's ready, they can go in and consolidate and create a single PO. They can also source the items using the sourcing module. So the P2P system itself can go off and integrate into source to contract, where you can raise sourcing requests and suppliers can log in, bid, respond, and you can award to them. And that can be your approved supplier. So it has got integration into the sourcing module if that's a module you're after or if that's a requirement you want. Otherwise, you don't have to have that at all. Buyers can request quotes. They can go out and there is a request for quote function within the standard P2P application. and they can request quotes from multiple suppliers if they want to. They can also use punch out. So they can punch out to an external website to source the items from as well. So there are lots of options there for the buyer. The buyer can also, when they've created the order, create the order as a draft. So if they needed to create the order as a draft, they can then manipulate the order if they need to. If they needed to add, for example, another line to it, for example, delivery charges or other items that the buying team want to also add on to that order, they've got the ability to do that. But all of this is configurable. So it can be very streamlined, or you can have lots of touch points if you want there to be. So just to highlight some of those points again, you can consolidate requisitions from the same supplier to a single order, or where the delivery address, where the supplier is the same and the delivery address is the same. So you get options on how the consolidation works. You can create draft purchase orders off the back of the requisitions, so the buyer can add additional lines to them. The buyer can also add additional reference information. If, for example, the purchase order being created needs to capture additional information related to prepayments or additional reference fields, then the buyer has the option to intervene and add that information in. And again, once the order is created, if you've got authorization workflows, it will flow through to be approved as normal. Additional features, you've got a funding request feature within Proactis. So funding requests was a new element of the system introduced a few years back, and it allows organisations to raise requests for CapEx spend. So they want something to be approved, but they don't want it to become a purchase order. So it's a facility for organisations to raise a request for funding inside Proactis, where there's a full audit trail. I mean, organisations do this all the time anyway. You know, if you need to buy a new unit or refurb the office, or, you know, buy, I don't know, get a confirmation that you can distribute all new phones to the whole of the company, there will be something that's approved offline. It may not necessarily be done in Proactis, but there'll be emails and there'll be a trail outside of the system. This allows you to bring that into Proactis. So instead of you sending an email and having someone sign it or someone respond, and, you know, it's not necessarily the best approach for audit, you can do this inside the system. So you can raise a request for funding. So you can raise a funding request on a separate template within the requisition module, where you can say, okay, I want to raise a CapEx request for a project that's going to cost, I don't know, £300,000. That can go off for approval depending on what the projects are and what it relates to. The approval workflow can be designed to send it to the relevant approvers. They'll approve the request internally, and once that request is authorised for the funding, that request itself doesn't become a purchase order. Okay, it doesn't become a purchase order. It doesn't get invoiced. You've got just the request inside the system that has a full audit trail on the approval workflows. But what it can do is it can go off, once that request has been approved, it can go off and create the project code for you automatically within the finance system. So whichever finance system you're using, once that project spend has been approved, it can go off and create the project code for you, bring it back into Proactis, make it available for you. So that project is an available accounting code inside Proactis. And then you can raise subsequent call-offs off of that originally approved funding request. You can raise call-off transactions. So instead of raising a purchase order or a requisition, you raise a call-off, and it will basically call off from the originally approved project spend. And you can see that in a summary. There are screens that show you that information, and you can also report on that. Any subsequent call-off raised will also be stamped with that project code. So you can report on the information very easily within Proactis on the original project spend and how much you've spent against it. So it's a really nice feature. We utilise it for lots of other things as well as call-offs. but I can just touch on some of the screens and show you what it would look like as we go through the presentation. We can also utilise the request module because we don't have to convert every requisition to a purchase order. We can use it to request other things. For example, I want to raise a new supplier request. So we can do that inside Proactis. Again, it's a process that will be happening outside of your system, potentially a spreadsheet or a form that's filled in, but you've got the ability to do it directly within the application. So we could mock up a form for you that the users have to complete if they want to request a new supplier or a new customer or a supplier amendment or a customer amendment. They can do that within Proactis. So they'll fill the form in, it would go off for approval. Once it's fully approved, it can create the supplier or the customer inside the finance system that will bring it back into Proactis as an available supplier or customer. We can also capture bank details as well, if necessary, but we've got the flexibility to do either or, and it can extend even further. So the request options can extend further. So it could be, I don't know, a new staff member you need, or a GL code, or employee, a cost code, a GL code, you know, or a travel request. I just want to request some travel. It doesn't have to become a purchase order. So we can really utilize this module. It can be quite powerful. So I'm just going to dip into Proactis. I trust you can see my screen okay where I've dipped in, and I'm sure Louise will let me know if you can't. So I'm just going to log in as a requester now. So I'm going to be presenting from the latest version of Proactis. So you might see some fields that you're not necessarily familiar with, but if there's anything you want me to go through at a later date, or you've seen that you think, oh, that's unusual, we want a bit more information about that, then again, please let me know. So I'm just going to log in as a user that has the ability to raise requests for goods and services inside Proactis. And it should log me in. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to navigate to my request screen. So typically you would be raising orders. So your business would ideally raise orders. However, what we're going to be doing is looking at the request feature, which is a request for goods and services that's raised up front before the order is created. Okay, so you can have, just like with orders and invoices, you can have multiple templates. If you wanted to, you could have a single requisition template and have all the items on it, and the system would know where to send things to. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to raise a request for some IT goods and services. So I want to request a phone. So I can see I've got items on here, but as a user, I don't necessarily need to know which one to pick. I can just pick a phone. And I'm also going to pick a laptop. Okay, and I can say I want one laptop and one phone. And if I expand the lines, I mean, some of them might contain suppliers where you've got supplier item relationships in place. That information can be filtered onto the requisition. If I just validate, depending on how you've got the system configured, it might allow you to put through a zero price. I've got some prices that have come through here, but I can continue adding items onto my request if I wanted to. I can use the search facility. Again, you've got access to a catalogue of items that you've provided the user with access to based on their permissions and the security around the templates. Okay, and when I'm ready, I can just submit my request. So I can raise items for all sorts of things. I could put stationery on there if I had permissions to. You can really combine everything. If I navigate to today's requisitions, I can see that I've raised my requests. They've gone off to be authorised. And if I just log in as the authoriser, and navigate to my tasks as the approver, I've got requisition items awaiting authorization, and if I drill down, I can see those requests. Now, obviously, I can filter my screen. I can filter by who raised them if I wanted to. I could change the columns on the screens. I've got the ability to manipulate what I see on this screen here. And as I mentioned, approvers have the ability to batch approve requisition lines. So they can actually just tick, tick, tick and click authorize at the bottom of the screen if they wanted to. Or they've got the ability to drill down. So they can drill down into each requisition line, see the information that's been provided by the user. They can enter a maximum cost. So they might say, fine, but you're not spending more than £350, and that will cap it. If the buyer doesn't have permissions to override the maximum cost, then they can't source the item for more than the price quoted here. The approver can also manipulate the coding and change the supplier if they need to, and attach a quote or other information if they want to, or a spec. And I'm going to authorize that one. They can drill down and view. So directly from this screen, obviously I'm approving at line level. Let me just untick these boxes. I'm approving requisition lines at line level. However, the approver has the ability to go in directly from here and view the whole document. So that requisition I created consisted of 2 lines. I can use the information symbol and it will take me in to view the original request of the original lines, even if they haven't gone to them for approval. So again, I can either drill down, put a maximum cost on and approve directly from this screen, or I can utilize I can just tick the lines and authorize. Oh, that's been done by somebody else. Let's just authorize. There we go. So that's what the approval would look like. And again, the approver has the ability to approve directly from the mobile app as well. They don't have to log into here to approve. If I log out and just log back in as my requester and just look at today's requisitions, I can see my 2 lines are currently released for ordering. So that's the status they've been given. Depending on how much intervention we want the buyer to have, it will determine what status the transactions get given. So there could be a status with buyer, which means the buyer needs to source the items. Or if these items are already coded against a supplier, or the account codes have been provided and there's a valid price, depending on the status of the item as well, will determine whether it still needs buyer intervention or whether it can go through and just wait until the buyer can convert it to an order. So I'll go through and show you, we've got a bit of a mix here of transactions with different statuses. So if I log in as the buyer now, this is the buyer's screen. So the buyer does have the ability to view a dashboard. They can see the top 10 supplier spend, or we can obviously manipulate the screen and show you a completely different view if you want to, and a different dashboard, but we can toggle and display and remove as necessary if we want to on this screen. So the requests that I just raised should be sitting oh, actually, let's have a look, drill down in here. So here are our requests that we raised today. So I've got my phone and my laptop. So if I want to create an order, they're waiting for the buyer now. They've been released. The system, if we had automatic consolidation turned on, it would automatically pick up these requisition lines and it would convert them to an order. And it would use the rules that we have in the background. So if we've said consolidate on supplier where supplier is the same, that's a minimum. It has to do that. Then it would do that. If we've asked it to consolidate on delivery address, that it would only create a single order where the delivery addresses are the same as well. So what I've got the ability to do is I can tick these lines. They are for different suppliers, and I can click consolidate immediately, and the system will know it needs to create 2 separate POs. So this is what it's proposing to create. I can click submit and it's going to generate my orders for me. So it's generated my POs. I can drill down into them from here. If they require approval, it will display an authorization workflow. Otherwise, they'll be fully authorized. But again, that's just determined by the order template and whether it has approval workflows assigned to it. So those requisitions I created earlier have been converted into an order. If I log out and log back in as the requester who raised the original requests, they have full drill down capabilities. So I can see my 2 lines, my phones and my laptop, they've currently been ordered. That's the status of them, they're ordered. If I drill down into them and expand the lines, I can see the PO that's been created. So they're 2 different purchase orders because the suppliers are different. And I can drill down into each of them and view the information. And once they're invoiced, again, I've got full drill down capabilities. Even if I'm not the owner of the purchase order, if the buyer was the owner of the purchase order, I would still have full drill down capabilities because I raised the requisition originally. The buyer also has the ability, so we've looked at requisition lines that have got suppliers assigned to them, they've got coding, they've gone through, they've been approved, they've gone through, and the buyer just has to intervene to create the orders, basically, just consolidate and create the orders. However, the buyer, depending on how the items are set up, the buyer might have to do more than that. So where there is no sourcing information provided, no supplier, no item, and the buyer might actually have to create the order line or the draft order line. So here we've got a request for some flowers, plants and flowers for the reception desk. The requisition has come through. There was also a caretaker required as well to repair a door on the same request, but this one is still outstanding. And what the buyer can do at this point is they can go out to a third-party website where they can punch out and bring the items back into Proactis. If they wanted to, they can request quotes inside the system, so they can go off and they can request a quote from various suppliers. If they wanted to send out the quote request, different suppliers with some text, they can do so. They have the ability to copy the request. So rather than creating it from scratch, they can click copy and it will add the item onto the proposed order line where they can go off, add the supplier. It's like they're creating a purchase order. They can specify the coding if it's not already provided, and they can store the item. Oh, so it does need additional coding. Let's go in and edit that. So it does all the normal validation. It's like the buyer is creating the draft order. Okay, and when I'm ready, I can submit for immediate consolidation. It will try and create the order straight away. Or if I wanted to, I could just submit item and it will be held in a stack along with other requisitions where the buyer can create a single PO. They can consolidate multiple requests and create a single PO for the same supplier. The buyer has lots of options. If I go back, I'm just going to log out and log back in as my requisitioner. So we've had a look at raising requests up front. So where a user just raises a request for something. As I said, it doesn't need approval. It can have an approval workflow on it prior to going to the buyer. The buyer step is an optional step. You don't necessarily have to have the buyer physically intervene and have a touch point on the system. Okay, however, you can have intervention, and if you want intervention, you can control how much intervention you want the buyer to have. So there's lots of options around that. Okay, once the buyer creates the order, it can become a draft order where it can still be manipulated, or it can become a hard order, which goes into the workflow for submission and gets approved. And then obviously once it's approved, it can be receipted and invoiced. However, I mentioned that requisitions extends further than just raising a request for goods and services. So you can actually raise requests for items that don't have to become a purchase order, don't go off to the buyer for consolidation. They're just requests, but we can, off the back of that request, do things with the integration. Okay, so we can have it fire off information into the finance system or any other third-party system. So new supplier requests. So obviously Proactis has a supplier portal. It's got a supplier directory where if you wanted to create new suppliers, you've got the ability to communicate directly with the supplier that you want to onboard using the portal, and they can communicate back as well. However, in the event that you don't have that module and you want a very simple supplier request form within the application, you can utilize the request module. It would be a separate template. And what we basically do is we create a form that would mimic what you would need to create, what the fields you would need to complete if you were creating a supplier within the finance system. Okay, so typically the supplier name, the address, the company information, VAT details, email addresses for contacts, tax code information, payment terms. Has the supplier been checked? Is it a one-off supplier? Do they accept terms and conditions? Now, these forms can actually be quite powerful as well. So, I mean, obviously, you'd expect a form that's being completed to go off for approval, but we can also send the document off for approval based on any of the fields that have been selected. So we can build approval workflows off the back of reference fields. So whether it's a free text field, we can say, send it to this person for approval if it contains this information, or off a drop-down list. So do they accept the T's and C's? No, in which case it's going to go off to be checked by somebody else because it requires additional intervention. So we can obviously build up workflows to correspond with the rules that you have in place within your business when it comes to creating new suppliers. We can also capture bank details. Some organisations want the bank details captured on the form purely for information purposes so that the finance team can check them. Some organisations don't do that, and they just have the bank details checked separately outside of Proactis, but we have the capability to do both, obviously. But the form will be completed, so let's specify we need a new supplier, new so obviously you provide the supplier name and the address details, and we can build in validation as well. So it can check whether the supplier already exists based on the description of the supplier and the postcode, based on the supplier name. So we can put validation in to determine whether the supplier already exists. The users do also have a search facility. So as they're typing in, I want a new supplier, they do have the option to go in and see if the supplier already exists. So they can return, and it will validate, obviously, within Proactis and outside of Proactis as well. But it's a great use of the form. And obviously, once they've completed that, it will go off for submission. It goes into the approval workflow. Once it's fully approved, it creates the supplier inside the finance system. That's the master. Once it's in the finance system, it will come back into Proactis, into the relevant supplier group. If you've got supplier groups on this form, it will come back into the relevant supplier group, and it will also update this form with the actual supplier code that's been generated as it hits the finance system. So when the supplier is created in the finance system, it can also use your rules. So if you want a supplier code generated based on the description of the supplier and a number of characters, we can pull that into the integration. Okay, so that's how you could create a supplier request. You've also got the ability to amend suppliers. So most organisations, when they start implementing a supplier request form, it's because they want a full audit trail on who's creating suppliers and why, and they want to take that out of the finance system. It then leads them to wanting to also do amendments via Proactis. So amendments are done in Proactis again, so there's a full audit trail against why the supplier has been amended, and then they take that away as a feature within the finance system. So supplier amendments, you might say, okay, I want to change the name of my supplier. So you'd have access to all the fields potentially where it's marked as a yes. You can put the new name in and submit the request. It will go off for approval. It will update the finance system with the field you've identified as a yes. Okay, so that's how you can deal with supplier amendments. In relation to funding requests, so you can raise a funding request. So for example, I want to, let me just have a look if I've got the right item on here. Provide details of your CapEx request. So for example, purchase of a new building. Okay, and it's going to cost £500,000. So obviously you might need to attach documentation, you might need to provide additional information in the form of reference fields, etc. You don't need to provide any coding. It's not going to create an order. It's not going to create, you're not going to be invoiced for this. This is just to get internal approval, and it's fully auditable. So we can put validation on to ensure that attachments are provided. But basically this would go off and get approved. Once it's fully approved, it becomes a valid funding request and you can call off against it. So any subsequent requisitions that are raised will potentially be stamped with the same number that this has given. So we can allocate this request a project code. We can say any subsequent spend, track it using this project code. So that will go off for approval. You've got the ability within the requisition module to view open funding requests. I'm just going to go into one I created earlier and just do a search. Oops, let's just take that out. Okay, so if I just drill down into a funding request I created earlier, this one was for IT servers replacement project. So that was authorized, and any subsequent call off that I raise will be visible within the call off summary. So I don't have any call offs at the moment, but if I wanted to, I can create my subsequent orders that are going to be raised against this project by using the call off feature. So as I create a call off, it knows it belongs to this original funding request. It will stamp that newly created request with the project code that's assigned to it from the finance system. If you want it to do that, that's optional, but it ties everything together. So you've got full visibility and you can view the information within the call off summary. Okay. So, I mean, the requisition module, it's, as I said, it's part of your standard licensed modules. It's available. It just needs an element of configuration. If you wanted to just have the standard request for goods and services, then typically there would not necessarily need to be any integration on that. It's just creating the templates, assigning the users, the items, the workflows, and those requests flow through into orders. So there'll be a small amount of design scoping required in order to establish your requirements, document them, and then help you work out the best way to achieve what you want to build, really. In relation to the requests, if you want integration on them, I mean, some people use the supply request form as just a standalone. They'll raise the request in Proactis just to get an approval workflow against it, and it can then be created in the finance system manually. However, if you want integration on that and you want it to create the supplier for you, then obviously there'd be an element of integration as well. But obviously, before we do any of this, we would have conversations. If it's something you're interested in, then we would have conversations with yourselves. Just reach out to your account manager, to Louise or Sarah or myself, and we can have a much more detailed conversation about your requirements and really go from there. But they're quite small projects. Rolling requisitions out is quite a small project, really. We'd do everything in test, obviously, before it was promoted to production. A copy of the recording will be available for download, and also the slides that I've used today. Are there any questions?
Hi, Christina. Thanks for that. No, there's no questions at the minute, but let's give it a second. If anybody has any questions, please pop them in the chat. No, I think we're all good.
Okay, great. All right. Well, if anyone does want to reach out separately, then obviously please feel free. That's absolutely fine. Just drop me a note, and I'll be in touch. Okay. Thank you. All
Thank
for
you,
your time
Christina.
today.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.